I had a debate recently with Deborah a person who has gained some fame and notoriety for what I would call anti-trans positions, certainly. And there was not an anecdote, sorry, she had the anecdotes. There was an example that I came up with on the fly during that discussion. Not to say that I invented it, by the way. I might have even mentioned it before, but in the context of that discussion, it very much came up in my head, and I thought it was a good one. So it's about gender and sex, right? Now, obviously, when we're talking about categories and words, we construct these things. So the idea that sex and gender could mean two different things, sex being biological and gender being social, if those are the definitions we want to use, those definitions are correct. We're not violating any rules of reality by doing so. To me, because these definitions are arbitrary, these categories are socially constructed, I think it's valuable to adopt which categorizations lead to the greatest social benefit. So, for example, our conceptualization of race has changed many times over the past few thousand years. Different societies and different times have had different ideas on how to categorize people based on phenotypical racial distinctions. Now, the modern conceptualization of race, which is basically, at least in America, you have white people, black people, Hispanic people, and Asian people, leaving aside that Hispanic isn't even a race, but it's not exactly consistent. A lot of people think that's just foundational, uh, objectively, ordained, materially provable way of categorizing race. Of course, that's not true. Real biologists study clines, actual distinct threads of genealogical expression, which vary depending on the region of the planet that you're in. And if you take a look back at, say, for example, the Golden Age of Islam, or look back at India, or look back at the Roman Empire, all the way back into the past, you'll find that even though the underlying genetic expression in humans is basically the same as it was 2,000 years ago, evolution doesn't happen that quickly, the categorizations laid on top of them are totally arbitrary, completely and absolutely arbitrary. You know, um, there are ones back then that just make no sense today. Like the Romans thought that the Nordic people were thin-blooded, no, thick-blooded because of the cold, and that was what made them stupid. And that the people from the southern Mediterranean and the Middle East were thin-blooded because of the heat, which made them clever. Something like that. Like, okay, you know? Now, even if their underlying, like, genetic qualifiers were unscientific, to say the least, the categorizations, you have lower, Middle Eastern people, and then the higher Nordic people, and you have the Roman citizen, that's not any more or less arbitrary a categorization as the one we have today. We basically judge racial groups based on a collection of phenotypical expressions like skin color, which reveal very little about the genetic material underneath. It is meaningless. Race is social, not genetic. They're correlative only insofar as they correspond to basic indicators we see and perceive. This is how I feel about gender and sex to a large extent. Is there a connection between gender and sex? Obviously. Most people are cisgender, after all. For now. God willing, we will change that. Biden, inshallah. But there is, of course, an association. Now, something Deborah So likes to talk about is that even if you were to believe gender and sex are different things, it's not as though gender is unaffected by sex. And she is correct in this respect, okay? Now, imagine you are a zygote. I know, you're very small now. It's crazy. And also not a person yet, legally, at least. we'll, we'll see how the laws get moved on that. But imagine you're a zygote, okay? You're being washed with hormone washes. It will determine a whole bunch about your body later on in life. And it turns out that many of the characteristics which are socially ordained to be a component of masculinity, say, for example, a shaved head, or think of another good example, wearing pants instead of a dress, nothing to do with biology. Anyone can shave their head. Anyone can wear a dress or a set of pants. These are social conditions. But there are internal biological markers that tend to predispose people towards roles and behaviors and mannerisms associated with the gender that they were assigned at birth. Or to put it another way, construction work is considered manly, is it not? And it's kind of a circular process where men, cis men, have biological markers that make them more disposed towards things like construction work, physical size and strength being obvious ones. And that means that socially, construction work gets to be both a sexual and a gender-oriented feature of masculinity. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Essentially, there are sexual characteristics that lead to a predisposition towards something, and then that gets roped into the gender role, and now you have something that's tied to both. And that's why there's often an association with being trans and being gay, for example, or with being kind of feminine as a guy and being gay, you know? We don't know the exact science and what makes people gay or trans or whatever, but we do know that these things have enough of a correspondence that there are at least interesting statistical relationships. Why am I talking about all of this? It's to bring it back to something that I talked about with Debrah, which was an analogy that I used while talking about the arbitrarity of social constructs when overlaid on top of biological reality. In the universe, light is a particle in a wave, I think. Don't hold me to it. And when observed, there is a spectrum range for light that is visible. It is called visible light. Keep up. You see? Radio waves over there on the widest, wavelength, as in literally the distance of a wave. Microwaves, infrared, and then visible light. Narrow, slim range. Ultraviolet, which bees can see, and X-rays, gamma rays, yada yada. We've all heard it before. Why am I talking about this? Well, visible light is a fact of the universe. The wavelengths of light are not a social phenomena. They can be measured by machines. Humanity could be wiped out in some cataclysmic apocalypse, and an alien species could, using machines which they have themselves built, find the exact same information on wavelengths. It's just a fact. But that doesn't answer a fundamental question. When does this stop being blue and start being green? If you could take the light from this and measure the wavelengths projected from it, you would get objective answers. There is an objective wavelength that could be traced at essentially any point. Any dot you could pull from here has a wavelength corresponded to it. But there isn't really an objective answer, is there? It's subjective. In fact, there are cultures that don't even distinguish between blue and green, if you can believe it. There are cultures that have much more fine-tuned distinctions between different colors than we do, How many colors are there? Obviously, there are an infinite number of distinguishable differences between wavelengths of light, but how many colors are there? How many genders are there, right? We recognize 2. There are cultures that have recognized 3 or more. The argument in these cases remains the same, that you can have an underlying, empirical, factual thing, like the wavelengths of light, and then nonetheless recognize that the categories we derive from it are socially constructed. Now, social construction does not mean total arbitrarity. Obviously, just because there's some variance between what green and blue is doesn't mean people are going to rope purple and yellow and everything else into it. But there is a degree of arbitrarity. The only reason I'm rambling about this is because I feel like the default response a lot of reactionaries have when one is arguing over gender and sex and what's factual and who's arguing against facts is so often they'll retreat to this like, well, you acknowledge that gender and sex are related. Of course they are. And then they're like, well, biological sex is a fact. There are two sexes. Not that simple. The American Scientific has a big old diagram on the way in which sex is bimodal with various expressions of sexual, gametes and a variety of our, our physical constitutions. I'm trying not to cough here. But they always rely on that. It's important to understand, and I feel like this is a really effective, like, 1-2 punch. They bring this up, well, sex is real. There are two sexes. Well, how many colors? And you can ask them, how many colors do you see here? Real question, by the way. So obviously it's a blend made of two. You've got blue and green, but they're really just two colors here. I mean, there's clearly some kind of teal in the center, right? I mean, like if you were to take this color right here, it wouldn't look like this and it wouldn't look like this. So there can't possibly just be two colors, would there? There's no real answer. I just think it's a valuable way of looking at it. Okay. At the end of the day, a lot of this discourse is fucking meaningless anyway. They don't really care. The arguments that a lot of reactionaries throw out when attacking trans people are just post hoc justifications for a pre-existing bias, one usually born of disgust or hatred or contempt or whatever else. But it is important to win on every front. It is important to win in every frame of the argument. You know, you don't want to give up on the front just because they're only pretending. Though it is, I think, usually worthwhile to as quickly as possible arrive at whatever it is they actually care about. An interesting question to answer, and one that I have not had the pleasure of arguing over with somebody before, is would you feel that a person is their gender, if they're trans, say trans woman, born male, whatever, would you say that that person is properly a woman if a medical process was developed for them to transition fully? And I mean fully. You can be as futuristic as you want about it, but I mean down to the chromosomes. Say they go into the gender vat for 24 hours, something like that. Would that them be? Would you then accept them assigned male at birth, had a dick, and then they undergo this procedure and they walk out physiologically indistinguishable? I mean, they could be surveilled in every medical sense. They would never be able to tell they were assigned male at birth. Would you accept that person as a woman? And the answer from a lot of these people is going to be no. Because obviously they don't actually care about the biology. They care about the female soul. They care about the male and the female soul. Sometimes they'll pretend and they'll go like, oh, well, if that happened, then sure, I care very much about the actual chromosomes. But I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to, wait, souls have genders? I don't believe that. They believe that. They think that people, a lot of them are literally religious. They believe that there's some fundamental essence to a person and that being trans is a corruption either of nature, if they're one of the more agnostic types, or of God's will, if they're not, and that to transition is to go against that fundamental construction. Does that make sense? That's super dumb. It's transphobia. What were you expecting? Vaush, the Bible says there are no women or men before God. Never does it say males and females have different souls. I'm not a biblical scholar, and neither are other people. If you don't believe that people have an essentialist view about men and women that is detached from biology, cite scripture of them if you want. I promise you, if such a procedure were invented, it would be decried as a crime against God. There are plenty of people right now who are holding on to the scientific argument by the thinnest veneer. And by the way, so really that's what we're going by, cell structure? There are trans women out there who are post everything, who are indistinguishable from cis women in any day-to-day function, including having sex with them. This person is, to these people, not a woman because of some ephemeral immaterial, meaningless biological distinctions, which are really relevant only to the woman and her doctor or doctors. That's the thread they're holding on to deny some social element of identity. So you really don't, do you really think if you could somehow cross that chromosomal gap, if you could really make everything exactly the same, they wouldn't find some other more fundamental distinction to latch onto? Look at how they talk about race, for God's sake. Like look at how they talk about a person who's 1/4 black, like the one drop rule. You know what I mean? We're clearly not talking about biology here. We have literal centuries of racist literature and pseudoscience which treats blackness in a genetic sense as some kind of infection in the bodies of white people who are afflicted with even a tiny proportion of it. Do you really think this is about biology? It's about souls. That's why I hate essentialism so much, Makes for bad arguments.